Certainly that's a familiar story to most all of us, where the owner of the vineyard has to resort to considerable means to get back his rent. And he thinks, wrongfully so, surely they will pay attention to my son, won't they? I'm reasonably certain that God had similar thoughts in his mind when he sent his son to us, to humankind. Certainly they will honor my son. Well, as we read about, there was this man who owned a piece of property, and he felt it would make a great vineyard. And he wanted it to be a total full-service operation. He just didn't want to grow the grapes and then sell them off to somebody else. He wanted to process them into wine and use the grapes himself. So he built this wine press by digging a hole in the earth. And then he built a watchtower over it, because there were all kinds of bad guys running around the hillsides and nobody ever knew what they would do to your property. So he made a sizable investment in his property, and once he had done that, he rented it out. And as harvest time approached, he sent a group of collectors to collect his produce. And they didn't have much good luck, did they? They were attacked, they were beaten, some of them were stoned, and one of them was even killed. And so the owner sent another batch of collectors to bring in the produce, an even bigger batch than the first one. And they were faced with the same results. They were beaten, they were stoned, and many of them were killed. Well, you know, about this time, if I were him, I would have brought in the army or somebody else. I would have given up trying to do it on my own. But not this man. This man was very proud of his property, and he wanted to collect it himself. So he sends in his son on a mission, and he thinks, surely they will honor my son. After all, he's the son of the owner. He has authority. But they didn't do that. They decided to do the same thing. They decided to rob him, to beat him, and to kill him. And you would think by now the owner of the land would crush these people and he would get his revenge. But that's not the way the story goes. That may be the way it really should have turned out, but that's not what happened. You see, this is the parable of Jesus Christ. And after telling this parable, he turns to his listeners. Now remember who his listeners are. His listeners are the Pharisees, and they're the ones that don't want to hear this story. They're caught up in it, and they're ready to take up arms. And they say, well, the owner will bring these wretches to a wretched end. And then he'll simply rent out his property to someone else in the valley, and then they will be more resourceful and they will pay their rent at harvest time. But Jesus, as he tells his parable to the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the priests, he says, have you never read the scriptures? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, he said. And the Lord has done this, and it is marvelous. It's marvelous in our eyes. And this was followed by stony silences from his audience. What's he talking about? They were thinking and maybe even asking themselves. Well, I mentioned that Jesus was telling this story to the Pharisees and the chief priests. And they had come before this passage asking him by what authority was he going to work? Who gave him the right to do what he was doing? What were his credentials anyway? Who licensed you to preach? Who licensed you to teach and to heal? By the time he had finished with this parable, they suddenly realized that it wasn't all about the owner of a vineyard at all. It was about them. He was talking about the chief priests. He was talking about the Pharisees who had robbed and beaten and killed. You see, they were the murderous tenants. And Jesus was the son. He was sent by the owner of the vineyard, God. He was the stone that they had rejected that would become the cornerstone. And Matthew ends his parable like this. He says, when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard Jesus' parables, they knew that he was talking about them. And they looked for a way to arrest him. But they couldn't, because they were afraid of the crowd. And the crowd thought that he was a prophet. And that was a chilling story for the priests and the Pharisees. But there's some really important elements to this whole story that I want to talk about this morning. First of all, in telling this parable, Jesus obviously knew the fate that was awaiting him. Could you put yourself in his position for a minute? Here he is, vibrant. He's in his early 30s, and that's awful young to die. And Jesus' life up until this point seemed to have so much promise. To many people, he was like a rock star of the day. Crowds numbering into the thousands followed him around. They hung on every word that he said. Some of those who followed him had already vowed that they would lay down their life for him. They would die for him. And if his country was a democracy and had elections, he could probably have been elected as president of that country. As far as we know, Jesus was a happy, healthy guy, kind of at the top of his game. But suddenly, his time is running out, and he knows it. And so he tells this parable. And he knows that there have been other young men and women whose lives have been cut altogether too short. And it's not easy to realize your life is nearly over, shortened by something that you have no control over. But Jesus did have control. At any time Jesus wanted to, all he had to do was step aside, to back out. He didn't have to do the work God had called him to do. Those were real drops of sweat and blood that dripped from his brow that night in the garden. He knew that he was going to be betrayed, and he knew that he had a decision that he had to make. Would he be faithful to God's call? Would he choose to save his own life. He could have done that. No one would blame him if he chose to back off. Say, I choose not to go through this. I don't want to do this. I'm going to go back and be a carpenter, like Joseph was, and live a safe, secure life. I'm going to get the proper credentials, and I'm going to become a religious leader. I'm going to live and act like those advocates do of the prosperity gospel. They live a pretty darn good life, and I can do that. He could have the world at his feet as a preacher preaching good things and riches. Can you put yourself into his skin? 33 years old, and a chance to make a choice to experience the pleasures that the world has to offer, or to make his life a sacrifice to others. Those are the choices that Jesus faced. Around the world today, there are young men and young women who face the decision about choosing a life of pleasure or a life of sacrifice. And many of them have chosen the life of sacrifice. Some of them are on the battlefields today, or have served recently on the battlefields. Some are on mission fields. Some are teaching small children in some of America's decaying communities. Some are working in hospitals, not because it's the place they want to be, but because they want to minister to those who are hurting. Many of them are doing so because their life has been touched by the example of Jesus Christ. Selfless love they have chosen. Mother Teresa is an example of selfless love. Well, here's something you may not know about Mother Teresa. An activist who worked with her shared this story about her in a book that he wrote called Irresistible Revolution. And in the book he wrote, people often ask what Mother Teresa was like. Sometimes it's like they wonder if she glowed in the dark and if she had a halo. She was short, wrinkled, precious, and maybe even a little ornery, like a beautiful, wise old granny. But there's one thing I will never forget about her. That's her feet. He says her feet were deformed. Each morning in Mass, I would stare at them and I would wonder if she had contracted leprosy. But I wasn't going to ask. I wasn't going to say, hey, Mother, what's wrong with your feet? One day, one of the sisters asked us, have you noticed Sister Mother Teresa's feet? We nodded and we were curious. And then she said, her feet are deformed because we just barely get enough donated shoes for everybody. And Mother Teresa goes into the pile and she digs down to take the worst ones because she doesn't want anybody else to have to wear the worst shoes that we get. And years of doing that have deformed her feet. Think of that. Years of loving her neighbor as herself deformed her feet. That's amazing, isn't it? She cared so much for others that she chose the worst pair for herself. Think about that the next time you have to shell out $100 for a new pair of shoes or tennies or whatever. As Jesus confronted the chief priests and the Pharisees, he knew what faced him. And he knew that this is a cruel time in history. Troublemakers are disposed of with little ceremony. Within a matter of days, he knew that he was going to be flogged with a whip and crucified naked on a cross. Not because he had done anything wrong, not because he was really a criminal, but because his own people had rejected him. And they rejected the kingdom that he taught. Even the religious people rejected him. The people who profited from the status quo certainly rejected him. So shall it ever be, and it is like that today. Those who promote the status quo are quick to reject the cornerstone. And he was that stone that was rejected. He was the son who was murdered. And why did he lay down his life? For you and for me. He laid down his life for you and for me out of love. That's the only reason. Love. Theologians have advanced many, many theories about why it was necessary for Christ to die. Some say it was so he could take the punishment that we deserved. Others said it was to ransom us for evil. Others declare that in order to do what the original Adam had done in the fall of humanity, it was necessary for a new Adam to suffer and die. Regardless of the theory of atonement which you believe, it all comes down to one word, and that word is love. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. Think about the transforming power of love. There was a remarkable story in the Los Angeles Times. It was about a young man in Japan who gave his life trying to save an older man. The older man had been drinking, and he had fallen into the tracks in the subway station. And here's the remarkable thing about that story. The drunken man was Japanese. The young man who gave his life trying to save the drunken man was a Korean. And there is still a great deal of hatred between the Koreans and the Japanese over World War II. In fact, this young Korean's grandfather had been put into slavery as a laborer in the coal mines for Japan during World War II. And this young man's stated purpose for going to Japan to study in college was to improve the relations between his country and Japan. He didn't know that he was going to have to die to do it. Never in his wildest dreams could he have ever imagined the impact of what his efforts had on the Japanese people. The entire nation of Japan was transfixed on this young man's actions in the subway as he tried to help this drunken man get out of the way of the subway train, and lost his life in saving the life of the old man. Many Japanese could not believe that this young Korean man would try to save a Japanese, because most of them would not have. That's not the Japanese way. There was a earthquake in Kobe prior to that, And many of the Japanese knew that most of the Japanese would help those that they knew during the earthquake. It was their nature. They wouldn't help those that they did not know. A few days after this tragic incident, there were a host of dignitaries came to Japan to honor this young man's heroism and his remarks, to give memory to this 26-year-old student who gave up trying to save them. Thank God. Thank God. There are people who are capable of such unselfless love. This newspaper didn't happen to say whether this young Korean was of the Christian faith or not. But the chances are pretty good that he was, because you may not be aware that Korea has one of the fastest growing Christian church populations in the world. And the Christian church in recent years has probably had the greatest impact in Korea as they have anywhere else in the world. This young man gave his life for another. He sacrificed for another. Selfless love. You see, that's Jesus' way, and that's why I think maybe this young man might have been a Christian. There is something that a writer by the name of Calvin Miller once said that I think we should take to heart. He said, Jesus didn't leave the world a get-well card. He got sick with it. He didn't exempt himself from the pain that he would later have to heal. Why have we not yet understood that this world was created for love, for compassion, for sharing, for jumping off of a railroad to save another? What would it take for us as a society to understand that this is the kind of world that God wants us to have? This is what God desires for us to love, like Jesus loved, like this young man loved. What would God need to do to get through to us as a society? Could he send his own innocent son? Would that do any good? Have him die for us? Would that work? Around the table one night, Christ passed a loaf of unleavened bread. This is my body, which has been given for you. Then he passed the cup, and he said, this is my blood, shed for you. Was it all in vain? Was it in vain? It was, if those of us who call ourselves his followers live only for ourselves. But it's not too late. Never too late. We still have time to think about what happened to that cornerstone who was rejected. Will you let him be the cornerstone of your life and give that same kind of love to your brothers and your sisters wherever they might be in this world of ours?